Welcome, welcome. My name's Scott Miller, and I'm an LSAT instructor with Manhattan Prep here in Durham, North Carolina. We're doing another free prep hour tonight. I'm excited to be here with you guys. I really enjoy these. And we're just going to go ahead and dive in. We've got a lot to cover in an hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, I do want to mention we do have a couple of more than a couple. We have a few other free options besides these free prep hours. You can attend session one of any of our either online or in-person LSAT courses. You can attend session one for free. We have a lot of really good resources on our website, a lot of free resources, whether you attend a class with us or not. So I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat window at the end of the session to some of our free resources where you can find out more information. If you're watching this on YouTube, then there should be some more information right there on the page about some of our free resources and options. So let's talk about what we're doing tonight, what we're covering tonight. Tonight's topic is going to be reading comprehension. And specifically, we're going to talk about comparative passages and reading comprehension. Everything we talk about tonight, even though we're talking specifically about reading comprehension comparative passages, everything we talk about tonight is actually going to apply to the reading comprehension section as a whole. So a lot of this is really general. That's kind of the good thing about comparative passages. They're a little bit different from the normal standard passages, but the good news is that all the skills that you use when you are reading a standard LSAT reading comprehension passage and answering questions apply really well to the comparative passages too. It's not like you have to learn a whole new set of skills for those. So we'll get kind of more bang for our buck tonight by talking about information that applies to both. And just to be clear on what we're talking about, so a standard LSAT reading comprehension passage, it's a single passage, 3 to 5 paragraphs, somewhere between 500 and 700 words usually. And then there's an accompanying set of 5 to 8 questions. With a comparative passage set, you've seen these before if you've been preparing for the LSAT, you have 2 passages, passage A, passage B, and then again, a set of 5 to 8 accompanying questions. So there are a few different ways that people approach comparative passages. One thing that some people do, and this is actually the way people approach even standard passages, sometimes people will read all the questions first and then read the passages. And the idea, or the single passage if it's a standard passage. And the idea behind that is that by reading the questions first, you have an idea of what to look for when you read the passage or passages. You can try that. You know, and one of the things people often ask me, you know, hey, I've heard of this method or I've heard of this technique, and is this a good idea? Should I do this? And what I say is try it. You know, take a practice test or just do an RC section and try that approach and see how it works for you. You may want to try something once or twice and see how it works. But some of these, you know, some of these techniques do tend to work a little bit better than others. So we're going to try to focus on the techniques tonight that we think are going to work best for you. But this is one method that people use. Read all the questions first, then go back and read the passages. Another thing that people have tried, I've also tried this with comparative passage specifically, is people will read the first passage, passage A, and then they'll answer as many questions as they can based on what they learned from passage A. You know, even like eliminating answers that they know are wrong just based on passage A. And then they'll go back and read passage B and then try to answer the remaining questions now that they've read both. Has anybody tried that method or either of these methods that I've just talked about? Either reading all the questions first or specifically for a comparative passage, have you tried, you know, reading passage A first, answering as many questions as you can, then going back and reading passage B? Have you tried those? So if you have, you know, again, it's always good to see, you know, sometimes how these techniques work. I've tried both, and to me, I'm not necessarily a fan for comparative passages of the reading passage A, trying the questions, you answer as many questions as you can, then read passage B and answer the remaining questions. And the reason is just because some sets of comparative passages just have too many questions that require knowledge of both passages. So I often find that I only end up answering like maybe 1 or 2 questions that way. It's not as effective as I might hope or as I might expect it to be. In terms of the other method that I just mentioned, in terms of reading all the questions first and then going back and reading the passages. And then again, this could apply to, you know, a single passage too, a standard passage, not necessarily just to comparative passages. Same thing, read all the questions first, then read the passage. That also, to me, doesn't work as well as you might expect. I find it's just time consuming. It actually doesn't save me that much time. And I end up investing a lot of time in reading the questions first, and then, you know, maybe not even really getting what I need out of that to have the passage make more sense. The reason I think it's not necessary to do this is because the most effective technique that we've found is to understand the types of questions you're going to see in reading comprehension, and then read the passage with that knowledge, with that understanding. In other words, practice reading these passages with the knowledge of the type of questions you're going to be asked, and then reading in a way that will leave you best equipped to answer those questions, right? So, and the reason this is effective is because there are actually only a limited number of types of reading comprehension questions. So these passages are on all kinds of different topics, all kinds of different subject matter, right? And the questions ask you about all kinds of different details. But if you were to go look at an LSAT from 4 years ago, and then look at the September 2018 LSAT, the most recent one that just came out, and you were to look at the reading comprehension questions, you would see a lot of similarities. These questions tend to, you know, kind of cluster into very similar groups or categories. So if you understand the types of questions you're going to be asked, and then you adjust the way you read based on that knowledge, and you're reading the passage in a way that will prepare you to answer those types of questions, then when you get to the questions, you have the knowledge you need, you have the preparation you need. And it's not really necessary to read the questions first. So when I talk about there being specific types of LSAT reading comprehension questions, what I'm talking about are basically 3 types. And this is maybe, you know, this is kind of a generalization. I mean, but broadly, there are 3 categories of LSAT reading comprehension questions. So there are identification questions. These are the ones that are asking you about something taken directly from the passage. So, you know, if the passage is about fish, you know, which of the following types of fish was mentioned in the passage? You know, sharks, starfish, or, you know, whatever, goldfish. So they're asking you to identify something directly from the passage. Those types of questions are not actually that common. So the other types of questions that you're going to see on the LSAT are the ones that you really need to be thinking about, because I think people are pretty familiar with identification questions. We're pretty familiar with you know, taking a test where you have to read something and then identify specifically what was said in the passage, what was written in the passage, right? You take you read a chapter in a history book, you take a history exam, you know, which of the following happened in 1922? You know, which of the following people invented whatever, you know, this thing, television. So we're used to having to identify information, you know, that we read from a passage. But the LSAT goes beyond that. So the second type of question that you're going to see in LSAT reading comprehension that you need to be prepared for is an inference question. And this is going to be where you have to understand an idea that's supported by the passage. Not something that's directly stated, but something for which there is definitely evidence in the passage, and a logical inference that you could make from the information in the passage. You know, so if, you know, I don't know, if the passage again is about fish, and, you know, the passage explicitly states that there are people in, you know, in this town in Alaska, and everyone in this town makes their living by fishing, right? Which of the following could you infer? Well, maybe you could infer that if the fish disappeared, these people wouldn't be able to make a living, right? It's not something explicitly said, but an inference you can make. And this is where you need to realize that you need to start thinking, and this is maybe seems like a simple concept, but it's a really important concept that people forget all the time in reading comprehension. The correct answer to most LSAT reading comprehension questions will not be a direct quote from the passage. And this really starts tripping people up, especially when we get to these inference questions, because you're reading this question and you're reading the answers and you're expecting to see something taken directly from the passage, and actually the correct answer isn't. It's not something directly from the passage. Maybe in some identification questions, you might see a word or phrase taken directly from the passage, but it's actually not that common to see that in an answer choice. So the other type of question that we see is called a synthesis question. And in a synthesis question, could be very similar to an inference question, actually, but a synthesis question is requiring you to take information from several parts of the passage to answer the question. Whereas identification and inference questions, the correct answer tends to be drawn from one specific part of the passage. A synthesis question, you're being asked to synthesize your knowledge of the passage as a whole and use your knowledge of the passage as a whole or information from several parts of the passage to answer that one question. And there's a lot of overlap between these two. And in some cases, really the difference between a synthesis question and an inference question, when it comes right down to it, the difference is just the correct answer. What does the correct answer actually say? So there is a little bit of overlap here. So these are the three categories of LSAT reading comprehension questions. And again, the reason that you want to understand these different categories and these types of questions is because if you understand the types of questions that you're going to be asked, then you will be prepared to read the passage in a manner that will help you answer those questions correctly. All right, so let's move on. And let's talk about how you're actually going to read. How do you actually use this knowledge, this information, to read a reading comprehension passage? Like, how do you're armed with this knowledge, equipped with this knowledge of what the questions are going to ask? And we're going to look at some specific questions, coming up. So I'm not just kind of leaving you hanging with this very broad information. We will look at specific questions, specific types of, a specific identification question, inference question, synthesis question. And you'll see how to apply this knowledge. But in general, once you understand the types of questions that you're going to be asked in reading comprehension, then you use that knowledge to inform how you read the passage. And what they do in these passages, if you've read some reading comprehension passages, you know that they often contain a lot of details. There's a lot of information in there. There might be like, complicated technical scientific terms, or maybe just, information about some novel from the, from the 1800s and a lot of details in there. They intentionally give you passages that contain a lot of details. And what you need to do is learn to prioritize the details. Not every detail in a reading comprehension passage is going to be important. And is going to be, in other words, this is one way that the LSAT is different from other tests. There are a lot of tests you take where you just don't know what you're going to be asked about. So you feel like you have to remember as many details as possible, right? And like the key to success in a lot of exams is to remember as many details as possible when you're reading, so you're just ready to answer any question. It's different on the LSAT. We want to focus on specific details. Some details in a passage are more important than others. So what we talk about in our courses, and if you subscribe to the brief email series or you've seen any of our resources, when we talk about reading comprehension and how you read the passage, one of the most important things to focus on is the main point of the passage. Why did this person write these 3 or 4 paragraphs? What's the thing that they want to convince you is true? What are they trying to tell you? The main point that they're trying to communicate. And we often talk about this in terms of something called the scale, because very often these passages will contain some type of debate. You might have a passage about some, early 20th century jazz musician, right? And the critics are saying something about this musician, that this musician's, not very original. And then the author of the passage comes out and disagrees with the critics. So it's a very common theme you'll see in LSAT reading comprehension passages, this debate between the author and the critics. But there's not always going to be a debate. Other types of when we talk about a scale, we're basically talking about like a main point and a counterpoint, right? That's what we mean by the scale. 2 sides two sides of a story or two boxes that you could put all the information in. You can think of separating the information in the passage into two separate boxes. So, but it's not always a debate. It's not always a disagreement. The author might come out and talk about a old way of doing things or an old idea versus the new idea. And the author's point is that this new idea is better, right? Or improved in some way or good in some way. The author might talk about a problem versus a solution. And the author's point is, hey, here's a problem. And the author's point is that there's a solution to the problem. But those are the two sides, the two types of details that are talked about in the passage. And the better you get at recognizing this type of structure when it's there, the better you'll do when you answer the questions, because sometimes the questions are going to directly ask you, about the two sides. Like they'll ask you about the author's opinion. Is the author, in favor? Is the author agreeing with the critics or disagreeing with the critics? Sometimes an answer choice will be worded in a way that misrepresents the side or the box that a piece of information should be in. So that's why we so often talk about this idea of a scale, because so many reading comprehension passages are set up with this two-sided structure. But that's not set in stone. There are one-sided passages. Those are a thing, right? So the author's goal, the author's point, maybe it's just a single main point. Maybe it's not really a scale. Maybe the author is just trying to highlight a distinction, talking about a certain like jazz musician and talking about why this musician is unique or distinct. And nobody's disagreeing with the author. The author doesn't, acknowledge any disagreement. The author just says, hey, here's why this artist is distinct. The author might be, explaining a theory, and there's nobody disagreeing with the author. The author doesn't mention any disagreement, just explains this theory, this idea. So be ready for both types of passages. Be ready for passages that do have like a two-sided structure, but also be ready for passages that are just more one-sided. But either way, any details that relate to the main point of the passage are going to be important. The other thing that we emphasize is making a passage map. And a passage map isn't necessarily a complicated thing. It's basically understanding the main point of each individual paragraph or the main topic. If there's not like a point, if there's not something that the author is trying to convince you of in this paragraph, then just what's the topic that's being talked about? What's going on in this paragraph? And then why is it there? What is the purpose? Like maybe the first paragraph sets up this debate between two sides. Maybe the second paragraph, the author gives her opinion, comes out on one side or the other. And then maybe the third and fourth paragraph are there to support the author's opinion. So the reason this is really useful to notice is because very often, if you understand the main point of one of these paragraphs, that is very likely to be the main point also of the passage as a whole. And all the other paragraphs are somehow like leading into or supporting the main point of that one paragraph. So you notice what we're talking about here. We're talking about structure. We're talking about paying attention to more of the structural details of the passage. And other details are, you may be asked about a specific detail. If the passage is about fish, you may be asked about, a certain type of fish mentioned in the passage. But generally, the idea of a passage map is you know where to go look. You'll have an idea of where certain topics were discussed. And if you do have to look up a specific detail, then you know where to go and look for it. And that's great because that means you don't have to try to memorize all the details in the passage. You don't have to, feel like in this brief amount of time you have to read the passage, you have to remember every detail. All right. So let's look at an actual reading comprehension passage and see how to apply this. And what I will do, the passage we're going to look at is from the June 2007 LSAT. So if you do have a copy of that, this is the free one that LSAC publishes on their website that you can download for free. You can go to our website, manhattanprep.com, on the LSAT page and download a free copy. If you have that, great. If not, I'm going to put this up on the screen anyway. So if you don't have it with you right now, that's fine. So I'm going to show you the first passage, passage A. Again, this is a comparative passage set. Instead of one long passage, you'll see two shorter passages. And then the questions are asking you to draw information from both passages in order to answer them. So I'm going to show you the first passage in this passage set. Again, this is June 2007, the second passage set. And this is passage A of this two passage comparative passage set. So let's go ahead and read this. I'll give you a minute, a couple minutes to read this. It'll take like 2 minutes to read this. Minute and a half, 2 minutes. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about this. Like I mentioned, in these comparative passages, you don't need to have a whole new set of skills to tackle these passages. You're using the same skills that you would use to approach a standard passage set or a standard passage. So as I start reading this passage, what I want to pay attention to, I mean, there might be a lot of details in here, but as I start reading this passage, again, I'm paying attention to the main point of each paragraph and why it's there. So this first paragraph, starts with a question: music and language originate separately or together? And one of the techniques we recommend and strongly recommend is something called pair, P-E-A-R. And if you know what pair stands for, put it in the chat window. If not, that's okay. PAIR stands for pause, evaluate, anticipate, and then repeat. So what that means is at the end of each paragraph, when you get to the end of a paragraph, you want to pause before going on to the next paragraph and evaluate what you just read. Take a moment to evaluate what you just read. If you're going to take any notes, this is the ideal place to take notes. So what I'm noting here when I read this first paragraph is just this basic question. It's about music and human language, and did they originate separately or together? So I might put little brackets around separately or together, because that's the point of this first paragraph, is they're asking that question. And then we're talking about how they're the same, right? So I might put a little note here, same. We're talking of both systems use intonation and rhythm, both can be produced vocally with tools, et cetera, right? Talking about how they're the same. And then as I continue reading this so that's the pause and evaluate. Anticipate is a really good technique to use if you feel like you're like zoning out when you read a passage, which happens sometimes, right? People sometimes find these passages kind of boring. So anticipate is before you go on to the next paragraph, take a moment and think, what do I think is going to happen next? So they just asked, did music and human language originate separately or together? They just talked about how they're the same. Maybe next they're going to talk about how they're different. Maybe they're going to answer the question. Like, you don't have to be right, but taking a moment to think, what do I think is going to happen next? What, after you evaluated the paragraph you just read, what is going to happen next? Then, it kind of keeps you interested. It gets you curious and thinking about, am I right or am I wrong? What is going to happen when I read this next paragraph? So now as we read this next paragraph, we're talking about brain imaging studies suggest that music and language, there are a lot of details in here, but they're basically talking about, again, if I get to the end of this paragraph and I pause and I look back, they're basically here talking about how they're the same. Music and language are the same. And then they say one noteworthy difference. All right, so now they're talking about how they're different. We already, we were talking up here about how they're the same. We're talking here about how they're the same. Now we're talking about how they're different. And then they come up with basically ending the note or ending the paragraph on talking about how they're different. So that's the main point of this paragraph, right? As I pause, I evaluate it. Okay, they're starting out talking about how music and language are the same. Now they're talking about how they're different. What do I think is going to happen next? Well, they still haven't answered the question of whether they evolved separately or together. We've just talked about how they're the same and how they're different. So maybe they're going to, I don't know, maybe they're going to continue talking about how they're different. Maybe the passage is going to answer that question of did they evolve separately or together? And so I continue reading, and then, it appears that music and language evolved together. Okay, so that's pretty important. That's answering that question in the first paragraph. And then notice there's another thing here, though, that like when I get to the end of this paragraph, I notice they've talked about them evolving together, but they also say has little adaptive value of its own. So it's kind of going off in a different direction. I don't know if anybody noticed this last sentence goes off in a little bit of a different direction. Once they resolve this issue that they evolved together, they make this other comment about music saying it had little adaptive value of its own and most likely developed on the coattails of language. Okay, so that seems important to me too. And if you notice, I'm not taking a whole lot of notes here. The notes that I've put on the screen are basically the notes that I would be, this is what you would see me, doing on my paper. The notes I would actually be taking on my paper. I don't take a lot. I'm just using my notes, my underlining and a couple small notes to highlight the main point of each paragraph and paying attention again to the ideas that show how these different paragraphs are related. So what do you think is the main point of this passage as a whole? If we look at the passage as a whole, what do you think is the main point? What's the author trying to convince us here? Somebody tell me in the chat window. Let's see what people say in the chat window. Just a few words. What's the main idea of this passage as a whole? Convince us that language evolved before music? Well, I mean, be careful because they do say right there in line 19 and 20, the last paragraph, it appears that music and language evolved together. So they're not saying that music evolved, that language evolved before music. They're saying it appears that they evolved together. But they do say that language seems to take precedence over music. Language seems to be more important than music, right? Music had little adaptive value of its own, most likely developed on the coattails. Maybe coattails was where you thought that, it evolved later. But coattails simply means like you're riding on somebody's coattails. You're like hanging on to somebody. You're not carrying your own weight. You're just hanging on to them. That's what coattails means. Not as much value. Music doesn't have as much value. So that's maybe, I would say you could think of either of those. Either of those seems to be the main point. They answer this question that music and language evolved together. However, kind of a little secondary statement there. It seems like music is not as important as language, that language is more important, has more value. All right, so what I'd like everyone to do now, I'm going to show you so we've just read passage A. I want you to read passage B, and you're just going to do the same thing. You're going to read each paragraph. At the end of each paragraph, pause. Think about what you just read. Go back and, don't read it all again, but just go back and quickly scan it and think, can you spot a few words or an idea, or even in your own words, the main point of the paragraph? And then once you've identified the main point of that paragraph, then continue. Keep looking at the next paragraph, read that, get to the end, and think for a second, what's the main point of this paragraph? And see if you also notice, how are these paragraphs relating to one another? Are they building off? Are there any similarities between the paragraphs? And then, again, there's 3 paragraphs in this next passage. So when you get to the third paragraph, do the same thing. So let me show you this other passage, the second passage in the set. And again, I'll give you 2 minutes to try to read this. Try to use, even if you have to slow down a little bit, use that pair process we just talked about. Pause at the end of each paragraph, evaluate what you've just read, think about it for a second, anticipate before you start reading again, what do I think is going to come next? and then repeat. Do that for each paragraph until you get to the end. All right, so that was about 2 minutes. So let's talk about this passage B here. Now this, I don't know if you noticed that this, maybe to some people, this might have seemed like a little bit more dense or complex language, right? And you have to be prepared for that in the LSAT. And I mean, I'm not gonna lie to you. If you enjoy reading and you read a lot, you know, and you can read quickly and you have good just overall reading comprehension, if you have the ability to read these passages and understand everything you read, you're going to be at an advantage on the LSAT. You know, that does help. However, if that's not you, you can still learn to do well in reading comprehension. You just need to put some extra effort into it. And one of the most important things you can do is don't get bogged down in the things that you don't understand. Right? So if you read something, like we have a tendency, if you're reading an instruction manual or you're reading a textbook for an important exam, you know, you probably have a tendency to read things 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 times, right? I got to understand this. And the test writers know that. The LSAT test writers know that. And they're going to put really complex language in here to tempt you to do that, to just read over and over again. So I would say if you read something, you know, and you don't understand it, maybe go ahead and go back and read it again, especially if it's like the first sentence of the passage. But don't read anything more than like 2 times, really 2 times, maybe 3 at the most. If you read something and you don't, you know, you read it twice and you don't understand it, just try to get an idea of what it's generally about. So this is, you know, like this first sentence, producing musical notes. Okay, Darwin saying something about producing musical notes. And then this next, and then move on. You got to be willing to move on. Like, okay, this is pretty complicated. I'm not really sure what's going on here. Let me move on. Even this next sentence, I mean, you might say, oh, I suggest that the enjoyment of and the capacity to produce musical notes are faculties of indispensable use. Well, faculties, like what are faculties? Maybe you've heard that word before, maybe you've read the word, maybe you know what it means, but maybe you don't. Maybe like, what is a faculty? Isn't that like the staff of a college or something like that? So, but faculty means like ability, right? Your senses or your abilities. But if you don't, you know, it's really tempting to focus on the words that you are confusing or that you don't understand. And what you should be doing is if you're seeing a lot of language that you don't understand, just focus on what you do understand. This is talking about producing musical notes. indispensable, right? Important, indispensable use to mothers and infants. And in the emotional bonds created by this interaction, we discover the evolutionary origins of music. All right, so they're talking about music being important here. Like, if that's all you get out of this paragraph, is it sounds like they're saying music is important. I suggest, the author is suggesting music is important. That's okay if that's what you get out of it. I would love for you to understand every single word you read with full comprehension, but you don't necessarily have time to read things 10 times on the LSAT. So get what you can out of it. Sounds like they're saying music is actually important here. Somebody says it's not, the author says it is. So that's our pause and evaluate. One of the things that now, I said comparative passages generally, for the most part, we're going to use the same skills that we use for any, like what we're doing here is the same thing we would do for any, even a standard reading comprehension passage. But the thing about comparative passage, and there being two passages, passage A and passage B, is you also want to notice, and you can do this, you might do this while you're reading, or this might be something that you pause and do at the end of reading the second passage, is you want to think, how are these two passages, A and B, how are they the same and how are they different? So this is saying that the ability to produce musical notes is indispensable, can't do without it. And we can discover, in this, we can discover the evolutionary origins of music, this bond interaction of mother and child. We can discover the evolutionary origins. So can anybody see, first of all, tell me two things, label them 1 and 2 in the chat window. 1, can you already see how passage B is first the same as passage A? Based on what we remember. What do you remember about passage A? I'm going to test your memory a little bit here. How are passage A and B the same? And 2, how are they different? Go ahead and put that in the chat window. So, yeah, they're describing the importance of music to humans. Is it important or isn't it? Right? Is it important or isn't it? Also, notice they're talking about evolutionary origins of music. Right? That's another actual similarity. But yeah, they're describing, like, how is music important to humans? Why do we need it? Right? The way they're different is right here in this last phrase in this first paragraph. Actually, before that, this last sentence, they're talking about music being indispensable. Remember that last passage, the end of the last passage, we said, music has little value. And now we're saying music is indispensable. Okay. So we keep reading, right? We've got the idea. We're talking about music being important. In this next paragraph, I'm going to move on kind of quickly so we can get to some questions. But this next paragraph, what's important in here? What do we want to pay attention to in here? What they end up talking about, there are a lot of details here. They're talking about using face-to-face mother-infant interactions filmed at 24 frames per second, right? So on a lot of exams, that's the kind of information you would think is really important. Like, a lot of people would underline that when they were reading this passage. Oh, they're going to ask me the number of frames per second. By the way, 24 frames per second, that's just like a regular, Hollywood movie film camera. It's nothing special, actually. That's normal frame rate for movies. But that it's a detail, but is it the most important detail? Is 24 frames per second what this paragraph is about? And really, no. They're talking about these mutually improvised interactions that contain musical elements. They're talking about mothers and infants and these mutually improvised interactions, these interactions that contain musical elements. So they're showing how, that's the whole point of this paragraph. They're talking about how the interactions between mothers and infants have these musical elements to them. Why is that paragraph there? It's supporting the first paragraph. This is providing support for the statement and the thesis in the first paragraph that music is important to humans, right? That it's indispensable. So, okay, great. So we keep going. And now they're asking about evolutionary advantage. Like, so why is this an advantage? Why is this important? And again, there are a lot of details in here, but really what it comes down to, the emotional bonds created in this pre-musical interactions that we're talking about here. And this is the same basis for the capacity we have to make and enjoy music would have conferred a considerable evolutionary advantage, right? So they're talking about how these emotional bonds in this music-like interaction give us some evolutionary advantage. That's what that last paragraph is about. Again, supporting the statement in the first paragraph. So this is what the big takeaway, because what we just talked about applies to all reading comprehension passages. Your ability to look at each paragraph, identify the main point, the main topic. Yeah, it's good if you can remember. I mean, if you remember details, okay, but not every detail is important. 24 frames per second is not important. The fact that mothers and infants are engaging in these interactions with musical elements, that's what's important in that second paragraph. The whole, increase in bipedality and, in the last paragraph, brain size increasing, yeah, sure, those are details. They may ask you about them. But what's important is this is demonstrating how these emotional bonds and these music-like interactions gave us an advantage, have a purpose. They're important to humans. That's what we want to focus on. Main point of each paragraph and how they relate to one another. And then when we talk about so this is everything I've been talking about here, just basically, like I said, relates to all types of reading comprehension passages on the LSAT. So the big question when it comes to comparative passages is the question that I asked earlier. If you haven't already spotted it, you want to take a moment and pause at the end here and ask yourself, how are these two passages the same and how are they different? So they're both talking about music. They're both talking about evolution, the history of our brains evolving to deal with music or to process music, understand music. That's how they're the same. The importance of music to humans in a broader sense, like we have in the chat window. How are they different? Well, looks like passage 1 is saying, music had little value, little adaptive value, whereas passage B is all about the importance of music and how music does have an evolutionary advantage, does give humans an evolutionary advantage, our brain's ability to process music and use musical thinking. All right. So with that knowledge, now we're prepared to answer the questions. We understand what the main point of each passage is, right? And we do that by focusing as we read on the main point of each paragraph and how these paragraphs are related to each other. Looking in that as we read each individual paragraph, as we pause and evaluate what we just read, looking for the main point and trying to spot that idea in one of those paragraphs that's the main point of the passage as a whole. Now, so what I'll do now is let's look at a couple questions and see how we're going to use this knowledge to our advantage when we're answering questions. And let's keep in mind as we do this, the types of questions that we talked about earlier. Does anybody remember what they are? Inference questions. Well, first, identification questions. We're just identifying something in the passage. Inference questions and synthesis questions. So we'll try to see, examples of these here in a moment. But before we do, I also want to talk about your overall process for reading comprehension questions and some tools that you want to be thinking about that are going to give you an advantage when you're answering the questions. So 3 important tools to use. One is pre-phrasing. So what we're very used to doing on tests, especially a timed test like the LSAT, it's really tempting to just, read the question and then look for the correct answer. And you need to, one of the LSAT speed on the LSAT is it's not really about going fast. It's about efficiency. It's about working efficiently. And you will be able to evaluate the answers much more efficiently if you take the time to pause before you look at an answer, before you look at the answer choices. You read the question and you pause and think about the question for a second. Try to, put the question stem itself in your own words, or see whatever words pop into your head. If you ever play that word association game, if I say sandwich, what's the first thing that pops into your head? If I say airplane, what's the first thought that pops into your head? So same thing, when you read a question stem in reading comprehension, read the question stem, pause for a second before you look at the answer choices. Just what's the first word that pops into your head, the first idea that pops into your head? And what you're doing, if you get, as you get good at this, you'll start getting an idea of what the correct answer should look like. You'll get an idea of what you're looking for in a correct answer. And you might, what we encourage you to do is learn to recognize patterns in wrong answers too, and what makes wrong answers wrong. And that might also pop into your head. You might have an idea. Bread. Just saw somebody put in the chat window, bread, sandwich, bread. Yeah, so you're trying to get an idea of, maybe like what a wrong answer might look like too. And when you're working through the answer choices, once you've, if you take a moment to think about the question before you answer it, pause for a second, it'll help you work through the answers much more efficiently than if you just dive right into them without pausing to think for a second. The other principle that you want to apply in reading comprehension and answering questions is the idea of working wrong to right. We've almost been, I think, programmed in our academic careers in a lot of tests to read the question, look for the correct answer. Read the question, look for the correct answer. And you'll find that you are much more successful on the LSAT by learning to recognize wrong answers, because they're really good at hiding the right answer. The right answer will be right. Some people say, oh, the answers in reading comprehension aren't really good answers. They're not really like totally right. No, they are correct. You can prove why the answer is correct. They do a good job of making them not look correct. They're not going to jump out at you right away as correct answers. But what you can learn to notice are specific reasons why wrong answers are wrong. And the better you get at that, the more quickly you'll be able to just go through the answer choices and pick out some, at least, 2 or 3, maybe the first time you look through the answer choices, you find 2 or 3 answers that you definitely know are wrong. Sometimes you'll be able to find 4 answers that you know are wrong. And if you've found 4 answers that you know are wrong, boom, you pick the other one, you fill in the bubble, and you go. If 4 answers are wrong and you know they're wrong, the other one has to be right. The other thing you want to focus on is knowing when to go back to the passage. When should I go back to the passage to either before I even look at the answer choices? Should I go back to the passage and check something? Or if I'm like down to 2 answer choices and I'm trying to decide between them, should I, do I need to go back to the passage to check? So let's look at how to apply this in real time, how to apply these principles in real time with some real questions with this passage. What I'll do is, we'll do this. I will have the passage, we'll have the passage available to go back and look at if we need to. But for now, we'll just look at the questions. Let's look at question 9 first. I'm going to go ahead and let you look at this question. I know this is kind of difficult if you can't actually look at the question. I know this is going to be kind of difficult if you don't have the passage in front of you and you can't go back, and you don't have the ability, if you don't have the passage in front of you, to go back and look at the passages. So I do, keeping that in mind, I want you to try and do the best you can. I'll give you about a minute to look at this question, and if you think you have the correct answer, go ahead and put it in the chat window. Here it is. Excuse me, that was about a minute. So let's go ahead and talk about this process. And again, one of the things, if you really want to do well on the LSAT, you should never just be It's important to get the right answer, right? I can't sit here and tell you, oh, it doesn't matter. Getting the right answer doesn't really matter. But what you always want to think about is, how did you get the right answer? Did you follow an effective process to get the right answer? So again, the first thing we talked about was pre-phrasing. I read the question. Both passages were written primarily in order to answer which one of the following questions. So this is asking me, and just thinking, pausing for a second before I look at answer choices, what is the question asking me? So it's asking me a question about both passages, not just passage A, not just passage B, but I'm going to draw my answer. My answer is going to be based on both of these passages. Primarily in order to answer which one of the following questions. Okay, so it's like the primary purpose of the passage. So think about the question types we've talked about: identification, inference, and synthesis. What type of question is this? So this would be a synthesis question. It's asking you about information that's going to come from, individual passages as a whole, but not just one whole passage, but both passages. So that makes it a synthesis question. It's asking you to draw information from both passages to answer the question. So now as I look at the answer choices, again, my goal is working wrong to right. I'm not looking for the right answer. I'm looking at each answer choice and asking myself, is it wrong? Is this answer wrong? Can I see a reason why it's wrong? So I look at answer choice A. What evolutionary advantage did larger brain size confer on early hominids? Now you might look at that and go, oh, maybe that's something that both passages talked about. But don't be fooled, because remember, this is where pre-phrasing comes in. They're asking you about the primary reason for the passage. And maybe, remember that word association game we talked about? Did anything pop into your head when you read that question? Both passages were written primarily in order to answer which of the following questions. Maybe like music popped into your head. Well, they're talking about music and evolution, or is music important? Something like that. So yeah, evolutionary advantages and music, hopefully music, evolutionary advantages, but hopefully music popped into your head too. And notice that answer choice A says nothing about music. It's about the evolutionary advantage of larger brain size. And sure, that was mentioned in both passages, but I'm at least suspicious. If I'm not, I might totally eliminate this answer choice because it doesn't say anything about music. And that was an important part of both passages. At the very least, I call it like a soft eliminate, like a half eliminate. I don't think this is the right answer. I'm not totally convinced it's wrong, so I might just, sort of halfway cross it out. Why do human mothers and infants engage in bonding behavior that is composed of musical elements? Now, I might remember right off the top of my head that was only mentioned in passage B. Human mothers and infants engage in bonding behavior. So I might eliminate that one right away. Maybe at this point, I might just double check. I might quickly scan passage A and say, did passage A say anything about mothers and infants? No. So I could eliminate it just because it's asking about both passages, and this is only passage A. Answer choice C. What are the evolutionary origins of the human ability to make music? Now I'm going to keep this around only because it's mentioning music and it's mentioning evolutionary origins. And more importantly, I'm not looking at this and saying, oh, it doesn't look like the right answer. It's not what I'm expecting in a right answer. I'm looking at this and saying, I don't see anything wrong with it. So I'm going to leave it. Do human abilities to make music and to use language depend on the same neurological symptoms? Sorry, not symptoms, systems. So, this is something that is mentioned in there somewhere, but it's not the primary point. The primary point is about whether the ability to use music is important or not, right? That's the primary point. What are the origins and is it important? So I'm getting rid of D because it's not talking about like the origins of music or whether or not it's important. It doesn't contain those elements that I know are like the main points. Why are most people more adept at making language than they are at making music? So I remember that, again, that's something that was only mentioned in passage A, not in both passages. So just by eliminating A, B, D, and E, I'm able to get to the right answer. C is my correct answer. I fill in the bubble and go. And actually, even if I only like half eliminated A, I might go back and, look at A and C again to see which one's better. But if I'm feeling like I'm in a little bit of a hurry and I'm feeling pretty confident in C, if I've done a half eliminate on A and I'm pretty if C looks pretty good to me, then I'll keep it. Now, maybe D, maybe you didn't like immediately see a reason to eliminate D. And this might be where, you're only able to eliminate 3 answers. And that's a pretty common situation too. When you're down to 2 answers, what I would do if I had only eliminated 3 and I was down to 2, I'm going to go back and read the question stem again quickly. Both passages written primarily in order to answer which of the following questions. And then I'm going to look at C and D again, read them again, slow down just a little bit, read them a little more slowly. And if I see something wrong with one, sometimes just by reading the question stem again, once you've looked at all the answer choices and eliminated some, just by reading the question stem again and reading these 2 answers a little bit more slowly, you might see a reason to get rid of one, or the other one might stand out as definitely correct. But that's the process we're using. Pre-phrasing, working wrong to right, considering whether we need to go back to the passage either before even looking at answer choices, or do we need to go back to the passage to confirm once we're looking at individual answer choices. All right, so let's look at another question. A few minutes left, and we'll look at another question. Let's see, what would be another good one to look at? Let's look at question 10 in this passage. I'll give everybody a minute to do this one. Let's see how you do with this one. And when you do this, again, I'm asking you to stretch a little bit because I'm asking you to answer this if you don't have the passage in front of you. If you do have the passage in front of you, great. If you don't have the passage in front of you, I'm asking you to stretch yourself a little bit to try to answer this based on memory. But see how well you can do, even if it's just practicing following this process. Read the question stem and make sure you pause after reading the question. What does anything pop into your head? At the very least, make sure, take a moment to think about what the question's asking. What is this question asking me? Does anything pop into my head, a possible right answer pop into my head? As you look through the answers, think about getting rid of the ones that look wrong. Write a little A, B, C, D, E on your paper. If you have some paper in front of you, cross out the letters of the answers that you know are wrong. And then if you have any answers remaining, pause for a second, go back, look at the question stem again, and then look at the answer choices. So let's go ahead and do that. Here's this question. Let's see how we do. When you have an answer, put it in the chat window, please. All right, that was about a minute. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to do something a little different. We'll look at both the question here and the passage. I'll have the passage open over here so we can look back if we need to. So each of the 2 passages, again, we're being asked a question about both passages. Each of the 2 passages mentions the relation of music to. Okay, so it's asking specifically about music. So what is music related to? Well, so if nothing else, you're keeping in mind that this is asking something about both passages. So the answer has to come from both. The relation of music, well, that seems pretty broad, right? That seems pretty open-ended. Like they talked about the relation of music to a lot of things. The relation of music to mothers and infants. The relation of music to language. The relation of music to evolution. So, but maybe one of those phrases pops into your head. Maybe that's what pops into your head. That's great. Right? Don't downplay the importance of having something pop into your head, because that just may help you identify one of these answers as more appealing or maybe less appealing. So let's go look at each of these answers. Bonding between humans. Okay, I'm suspicious of A right away because that seemed to be more the topic of the second paragraph. But maybe I'll do like a half eliminate there. The second passage, sorry. I don't really, I'm thinking that the first passage wasn't that much about bonding between humans. That was more of a second passage thing, but I don't know. Human emotion. That was definitely in the second passage. I mean, it seemed to be talking about emotions, but I'm not sure about the first passage, so I'll leave it. And this is a really important strategy tip too. Don't feel like you have to decide right away the first time you look at an answer choice, whether it's right or wrong. The only thing I care about when I'm looking at an answer choice for the first time is it wrong? Do I clearly see something wrong about it that lets me eliminate that answer choice? I don't spend any time at all when right now at this point, my first time looking at answer choices, I'm not going to spend any time trying to convince myself it's right. I'm going to look at it. Is it wrong? If I can't see a reason why it's wrong, I just leave it. Just leave it. So I'm going to leave this one. I don't know if it was in passage A, but I know it was in passage B. Neurological research. I might leave that one too. Increasing helplessness of hominid infants. Okay. Was that in there? Increasing helplessness. That sounds like something that was in the end of the last passage. I don't remember that from the first passage, so I'm going to get rid of that one. The use of tools to produce sounds. I think that was only in the first passage. I don't remember that in the second passage, so I'll get rid of that. So maybe I can get rid of 2 answer choices, and I've kind of half eliminated one, and now I got to make my final decision, right? So again, this is where that last question comes in. Do I go back to the passage? And, you might trust your instinct. Like, out of all these answer choices, I remember that human emotion that definitely seemed to be part of what they were talking about, the bonding between, mothers and infants. They were talking about that in passage B. In fact, I could probably go back and find that pretty quickly. Emotional bonds, right? Right here in this line 35, we talk about the emotional bonds. So cool, passage B has it. What about passage A? I could quickly scan, both systems, language and music, use intonation and rhythm to communicate emotions. Just right there. Just looking for the word emotion, I found it, and I can select B. So one of the most common times when you're going to go back to the passages, after eliminating some answer choices, I might need to go back to the passage and just look for a word. Look for a word to see, does it appear in both passages? Can I find, the part of each passage that talks about that? And can I confirm that that answer is right or wrong? So these are some of the fundamentals of reading comprehension. And I'm going to go ahead and stop here. But what I hope you take away from this, a few different things that you want to take away from this. Think about your, and I'm just going to kind of leave this as an open-ended question for you to answer yourself. But what do you want to remember about LSAT reading comprehension passages and questions? If you want to get the most out of this session, take some time right now to write a few notes. Was there anything in here that you're not doing that we talked about? Anything that you're skipping over? Anything that you're rushing through? Think about your process. How are you reading the passage? What's important when you're reading the passage? Are you paying attention to the things that we talked about? What's important when you're answering questions? Are you, reading the question, then just looking for the right answer? The LSAT is not going to be your friend if you do that. Are you using this process of looking for reasons why wrong answers are wrong? And one of the things that I'm going to suggest that's really important is to review. So it's really tempting to take a practice test or to work through a single reading comprehension passage, and you finish it and you check your answers, and then you just see how many you got correct. And you either feel good or you feel bad, and you go eat a cupcake to make yourself feel better, whatever. Sounds like something I do. But reviewing your work is so important. So once you've completed a passage, before you even check the answers, go back and, once you've completed a passage, check the finish, answer the questions. Maybe you're taking a full practice test. Maybe you're just doing a single passage, whatever you're doing. Anytime you do timed work, before you even check answers, go back and reread the passage. Think about, did you read it a little more slowly than you read the first time? Take your time, put your feet up, grab a cup of coffee or whatever, put your feet up and read the passage more slowly. See if you can notice the main point of each paragraph. and how the paragraphs related to each other. Did you notice it the first time? If you look at any notes you took on the passage, do they, does your understanding when you read a little more slowly match your understanding when you were reading faster? Look at the passage in different ways, try to think about just the main point, underline the main point of each passage. Look for any indicators of opinions, like if they mention someone, a person, circle that. Somebody has an opinion, somebody says something, scientists say something, critics say something. And then when you review the questions, go through this process we just talked about. Read the question and then cover up the answers for a second and go through a prephrase. As you look at each answer, make sure you clearly know why each answer is wrong. Never settle for just a general sense that an answer is wrong. You want to know exactly why an answer is wrong. See if you can go find something in the passage that contradicts or says something different from what the answer. See if you can find proof in the passage that the answer is wrong. And then always understand why the correct answer is correct. Again, never be satisfied with just a general sense of why the correct answer is correct. Look at the question again, look at the correct answer or the answer that you think is correct, and see if you can find support for that in the passage, the parts of the passage that support that answer. Also, anytime you're doing timed work, evaluate your timing. Make sure you take some time to think about, how long did I spend reading the passage? Did I go too fast? Did I go too slow? How long did I spend on each question? Did you spend 2 minutes answering one question? They're only worth 1 point. Every question is only worth 1 point. And, if you're spending a lot of time answering one question and you're not getting to 2 or 3 others because of it, that's not really a worthwhile. You're not investing your time wisely. So try to think about how much time you're spending on each question, and be willing to, every question is only worth 1 point. Sometimes it's worth, and it is very worth, just taking a guess and moving on. So, did you make that decision? Did you make that decision wisely? Are you using your time wisely? So just a couple more things before we call it an evening. First of all, I'm going to put in the chat window a couple links. And again, if you're watching this on YouTube, you should see these on the page with the recording. But some information about our upcoming courses, some information about our free resources. And you can go to those links and check out. We have a lot of good resources on our, a lot of good free resources on our website. So make sure you check those out. Again, if you want to attend one of our online classes for free, you can attend session 1, the first session, for free. See if you like the course, see if you want to attend the whole thing. You can do that in person or online. And what I'll do now is, if anybody has any questions, that's pretty much the whole shebang. Thank you for being here. Cool. Yeah, thanks. Excellent. Tom put his takeaways in the chat window. That's great. So yeah, if you have any questions, if you want to put a question or two in the chat window, I'll take another minute or two to answer questions you might have. Other than that, we'll go ahead and call it a night. Let me just hang out. I'll hang out for a minute and see if anybody has any questions. All right. Well, hopefully I'll see you either online or maybe in an in-person class sometime. Come on back for our free prep hours. We do at least 1 or 2 of these every month. Love to see you here. Check out the other ones on YouTube if you haven't seen our other free prep hours on YouTube. And yeah, check out our website. Check out some of the free resources on our website. There's a lot of good stuff there to help you prepare for the LSAT. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a good night.